between the wide plains of the Montana Territory. 1881, where the wind swept through wild grass hills and the distant whistle of the train echoed across the horizon.
I know,
The young woman boarded in silence.
We need to keep moving.
Clara Whitmore carried no dowry, no fancy luggage, only a worn photograph of her sister, the woman she was sent to replace as a mail-order bride. They said men on the frontier only wanted a pretty face and a pair of hard-working hands.
There.
But what happens when the woman who arrives isn't the one in the picture? If you were Clara, would you tell the truth or pretend? Just to know what it feels like to be loved, even once. On the far side of the prairie, Samuel Carver, a rancher who'd lost his wife in a blizzard years before, waited for the woman he believed might heal his broken life. But when she stepped down from that train, he didn't see the woman from the photograph. He saw a pair of frightened eyes and a heart that still knew how to love. And from that moment on, one question lingered in the open Montana sky. Could true love ever grow from a letter sent to the wrong bride? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit like and share and subscribe to our channel for more stories of love, hope, and second chances across the old American frontier. There are mornings in the Montana Territory when the sun just begins to rise above the distant ridgelines, and the light slips through the thin threads of mist still clinging to the grasslands, making the whole world look freshly washed in an old, quiet kind of peace. In 1881, the American frontier was still a land half wild, half hope, a place where everyone came carrying both a dream and a wound. The men there lived with the land. They didn't just plow and herd, they endured long winters, fierce winds, and loneliness. They were strong, silent, and sometimes they forgot how to speak the language of tenderness. The women, few but fearless, came from the faraway east from places with trains, churches, and little schoolhouses. They brought with them the fragile hope of beginning again, even knowing that the land ahead promised nothing. They were called mail-order brideswomen who came west by letter. Just one photograph, a few lines of introduction, a simple promise, and two strangers' destinies became tied together in blue ink. It sounds strange now, but back then, love wasn't something you searched for. It was something you hoped for, tried for, and if you were lucky, learned to believe in. On the southern edge of Montana lay a valley called Willow Creek, where the wind whispered through old willow trees and paused beside a shallow stream. There stood a wide stretch of land known as Carver Ranch, famous for its purebred horses and for its owner, Samuel Carver. Samuel had once been a man of faith and laughter, until he lost his wife in a blizzard 4 years ago. Since then, he mostly talked to his horses. His violin gathered dust on a wooden shelf. People said Samuel had eyes that could see far, but no one knew what he saw anymore. Maybe it was the past, or maybe it was the one thing he feared he'd never find again: peace. Meanwhile, over 2,000 miles away in Richmond, Virginia, a young woman named Clara Whitmore stood by a small window, watching a black iron train breathe smoke across the station yard. Her father had died young. Her mother was frail. Her sister, Margaret, was the one the family pinned their hopes on. Clara was always the one behind the window, the quiet one, the helper, the girl who was never chosen. When a marriage proposal arrived from Montana, it was meant for Margaret. But through one careless decision and a touch of selfish calculation, Clara was the one sent in her sister's place, carrying Margaret's photograph and a trembling heart full of fear. No one in the family came to see her off. Only her mother stood on the porch, whispering softly, "Don't cry. Clara, Maybe out there you'll finally see yourself. The train ride took 7 long days across the country past golden cornfields, pine forests, and snow-capped mountains. Each night, Clara clutched Samuel Carver's letter, reading it over and over, his uneven handwriting plain but sincere. If you come, I promise there will be a place in this house for your laughter.
What is going on?
I know,
Simple
but things
words.
have changed. We need to
But they
keep
made her
moving.
believe that somewhere out there, a man might not be looking for perfection, only for a true heart. At Willow Creek, Samuel stood on his porch, eyes fixed on the dusty road that led to the new train depot. The mailman had told him his bride would arrive today. He didn't know why his chest felt tight. Maybe because he'd forgotten what it was like to wait for someone. Overhead, crows cut across the pale sky. In the distance, the train whistle screamed through the wind. Samuel straightened his collar, brushed his sleeves, like a man about to step into something he didn't yet know whether it would be a beginning or an ending. By noon, the air smelled of hay and wood smoke. The train came to a halt, hissing out clouds of white steam. From the third car, a small woman stepped down a plain dress, a wooden suitcase, eyes darting nervously, as if afraid she'd arrived at the wrong place. Samuel walked forward. He remembered the photograph, a confident woman with golden hair and a bright smile. But the woman standing before him was different, dark brown hair, a gentle face, and eyes that lowered quickly under his gaze. He froze, and in that breath between the wind, the train, and the steady beat of his heart, Samuel realized this was a real woman, not a picture. Clara lifted her eyes, and when she saw the man before her, his sun-browned hands, his tired yet kind eyes, her heart went still. She knew the truth would have to come out. But in that fragile moment, when he spoke, "Hello there, I'm Samuel Carver," she found herself wishing she were the woman in the photograph. Just for one day, just long enough to deserve that look in his eyes. That afternoon, the wind swept across the Montana prairie just as it had for centuries. No one could have known that from a mistaken letter. A true love was quietly beginning, not born of promises, but of the quiet courage of two people who had both forgotten how to believe. The day Clara Whitmore set foot in Montana, the sky burned with the color of aged copper, that rare kind of light you only see on the frontier, where the sun seems to set half the heavens on fire before sinking behind the distant mountains. The train's whistle still echoed faintly, leaving behind a swirl of red dust and a small woman standing alone on the platform, clutching a weathered wooden suitcase. The wind swept in from the prairie, teasing at her dark brown hair, tugging the frayed ribbon tied at the end. For a moment, Clara looked like a reflection of the land itself, plain, gentle yet quietly unbreakable. Before this journey, no one had ever truly chosen Clara, not because she lacked virtue or beauty, but because she was too quiet in a world that only noticed what shone brightly. Back in Richmond, people always praised her sister, Margaret, beautiful, witty, magnetic. Margaret could walk into any room and command attention. Clara, meanwhile, was the one who lingered by the doorway, listening, smiling, and quietly picking up what others left behind. When their father died, Clara became the silent backbone of the family. She rose early to cook breakfast, mended worn sleeves, and spent her evenings bent over faded books. She never dreamed of ballrooms, lace dresses, or grand proposals. All she wanted was a life of peace, one where her heart didn't have to compete. But in that house, humility was mistaken for weakness, and in a time when beauty could buy a future, Clara was simply invisible. When the letter from Montana arrived, it brought not joy, but a long, heavy silence. It was from Samuel Carver, a widowed rancher seeking a partner to share his homestead at Willow Creek. Her uncle, who managed the family affairs after her father's death, decided Margaret would be the one to go. But everything changed in a single night. Margaret cried, insisting she couldn't leave real opportunities behind in the city. And Clara, the one nobody asked, was told, "This is the only way you can help the family." No one offered her a kind goodbye. The next morning, she was sent to the station, carrying her sister's photograph, her mother's handkerchief, and the unanswered letter that had started it all. People say trains carry you to new lands. For Clara, it carried her toward a part of herself she had never dared to see. During the 7-day journey, she sat by the window, watching the landscape shift from flat plains to pine forests to snow-covered peaks. She didn't know what waited at the end: a stranger for a husband, a lonely ranch, or just another silence. But despite her fear, Clara harbored no bitterness. There was a quiet resolve in her, as if, no matter how the world changed, she would still choose to be kind. She shared her bread with a pregnant woman passing through Nebraska, helped soothe a lost child by whispering stories of golden barley fields in summer. No one knew her name, but everyone remembered her smile, a smile that made people believe goodness still had a place in this world. When the train finally reached Willow Creek, Clara realized Montana was nothing like she'd imagined. No cobblestone streets, no polished carriages, only wind and earth raw and endless. Yet within that vast emptiness, there was something that felt strangely like belonging. It was as if the land itself had room for those who'd been left behind. Far ahead, a lone light flickered across the plain Carver Ranch, and somewhere within its quiet fences, Samuel Carver was waiting. And this is where the story begins to turn. Between the dust and the wind, two souls weathered by loss would finally meet, not as in the photograph, not as written in the letter, but as two hearts learning to recognize truth in a place that promised nothing else. As the sun dipped low, Samuel saw her the woman the letter had promised would bring laughter back into his home. But when she stepped off that train, he knew at once this wasn't the woman in the photograph. And in that single moment, he didn't yet realize that his life was about to change, not because of fate, but because of kindness. That afternoon, the wind swept over the rolling hills of Willow Creek, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and hay smoke. On the wooden porch of a weathered ranch house, Samuel Carver sat at his old desk, staring at a sheet of yellowed paper. He had written and torn up more than a dozen attempts,
promised me we would be
each one
safe here.
crumpled
What is going
and tossed
on?
aside.
I know, but
Beside
things have
him lay a
changed.
dust-covered
We
violin,
need to
the
keep
only
moving.
thing left of his late wife, gone 4 winters ago. The last winter had been brutal. His horses had fallen ill. Snowstorms had torn 3 roofs from the barns, and his evenings were filled with nothing but the hollow silence of a house without laughter.
There. That should hold it.
Samuel had long believed he
perfect.
was born for solitude until one day he received a letter from a friend back east, telling him about the so-called mail-order brides women who volunteered to travel west and begin anew. At first, he laughed. The idea of choosing a wife through letters felt like something out of a bad joke. But later that night, as the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, the silence pressed in, and the laughter died in his throat. So one evening, Samuel lit a lantern, opened an old ledger that used to hold his debts, and instead of numbers, he began to write slowly, awkwardly, but from the heart. My name is Samuel Carver. I'm a rancher in Willow Creek, Montana. My ranch has land, horses, and a roof, but no laughter. I don't know how to begin this properly. If anyone reads these words, I want them to know I'm not looking for a beautiful woman, just one who wants to stay. He signed his name at the bottom. Samuel Carver folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and sent it off on the morning train. He didn't know it then, but that simple letter would open a new chapter not only for himself, but for a young woman 2,000 miles away, under a very different sky, in Richmond, Virginia. The letter arrived at the Whitmore home on a heavy, humid summer morning. It was Clara's uncle who opened it first. He read aloud in a mocking tone, then tossed it onto the dining table. A horse rancher from Montana wants a wife. Says he doesn't care about looks. Well now, Margaret, that sounds just perfect for you. The table erupted in laughter. Only Clara stayed silent, broom still in hand, sweeping the corner of the room. Her sister Margaret, beautiful and quick-witted, skimmed the letter and smirked. Can you imagine? Clara living out there among cattle and blizzards? Who would ever want a life like that? The words floated softly through the air, but to Clara, they landed heavy, like ash falling inside her chest. Because in that laughter, she saw her own reflection, the girl no one chose, the one who only existed as a quiet afterthought. A week later, a reply was written, not by Clara, but by Margaret, under her uncle's direction. It described a well-educated young woman, skilled in household work, who loves the prairie and longs to share life with a hard-working husband. The photograph enclosed was Margaret's her in a white dress, hair curled, eyes full of pride. And then, as if fate decided to play a cruel trick, Clara was called into the parlor a few days later to hear the news Margaret can't go. You'll go instead. You'll take her picture with you. No one asked if she agreed. They only said, the family needs you to do the right thing. Clara nodded. She didn't cry. She simply went upstairs and began to pack. That night, she sat beside a small candle, reading and rereading the very first letter, the one she had quietly picked up after everyone else had finished laughing. Am not looking for a beautiful woman. It said, only for someone who wants to stay. For the first time in her life, Clara felt something stir inside her, a fragile flicker of hope that somewhere out there, someone might see worth in honesty itself. The morning Clara left home, the rain had just stopped. Her mother held her close, saying nothing, only pressing a half-finished embroidered handkerchief into her palm. Keep this, she whispered, as you would keep yourself. Margaret stood on the porch, avoiding her sister's eyes. The uncle merely muttered, right when you get there, let us know you're settled. The train whistle screamed long and low, pulling the breath of her old life along with it. Clara sat by the window, watching the smoke twist backward in the wind. The letter from Samuel clenched in her hand.
We would be safe here.
She didn't know why, but she believed the man who wrote those lines was a simple rancher. There was something in his words, a trace of loneliness, of quiet strength, of goodness rare enough to feel like faith. Somewhere along that same horizon, as the train crossed mountains and rivers, Samuel Carver sat at his desk again, writing another letter, shorter this time, but truer than any before. If you do come, I can't promise riches. All I have are my hands, my home, and a hope that someone might one day call me family. He didn't know if the letter would ever reach anyone, but somewhere between the ridges and the sky, fate had already chosen the one heart meant to hear it. The train crossed plains and rivers, carrying a woman who promised nothing but kindness and a letter filled with quiet faith. On the other side, a man waited, never suspecting that the one coming to him wasn't the woman he'd been promised, but the one he truly needed. That morning, when the train pulled out of Richmond, the rain fell in threads thin, silver, almost invisible, sliding quietly across the old tiled rooftops of the city. Inside the crowded station, Clara Whitmore stood still amid the rush of travelers, clutching the small wooden suitcase that held everything she owned and the velvet-wrapped photograph of her sister. People said that trains heading west carried hope. But for Clara, this was a journey of a heart that had been both abandoned and determined to survive. The whistle shrieked long and sharp, and when the steel wheels met the track, she knew there was no turning back. Her mother lifted a hand in farewell, just once before her figure vanished into the pale morning mist. No one had promised that happiness awaited her. Still, Clara chose to believe somewhere beyond the horizon there might be a life where someone would see her for who she truly was, not for the photo she carried, nor the name she bore. Inside the train, the air hummed with movement. Wind slipped through the window cracks, whistling softly, mixing with the smell of coal and burned wood, warm, heavy, almost suffocating. Clara sat by the glass, watching the scenery blur past the red brick buildings fading into wide plains and thick forests of pine. Beside her sat a pale young woman, heavily pregnant. Her husband, a miner, had gone ahead to Wyoming in search of work, leaving her to make the journey alone. Each time the train jolted, the baby kicked hard, and the woman grabbed Clara's hand, trembling. "If I faint, will you help me?" she whispered. Clara didn't hesitate. She took out her mother's embroidered handkerchief and pressed it gently to the woman's forehead. Her movements were slow, careful, the kind of gentleness born from a lifetime of caring for others, without ever being noticed. She stayed awake the entire night. By the time the train reached Nebraska, the dawn sky had turned crimson, and the baby came weak, but alive. The mother held Clara's hand, tears falling onto the handkerchief.
There.
"You're an angel,"
That should hold
she
it.
cried softly.
It's perfect.
"Without you, I wouldn't have made it." Clara smiled faintly. "No, I'm just someone traveling the same long road as you." But as the morning light filtered through the small window, everyone in that car knew for the first time in her life, Clara had been called a savior. And perhaps in that fleeting moment, God himself finally saw her one soul among thousands, trying to find her way on the edge of the frontier. Days passed. The train rolled on through golden cornfields and quiet towns buried between sand and snow. Clara reread Samuel Carver's letter again and again, tracing the slanted handwriting with her fingertips, as though listening to his voice between the grind of iron and steam. "I'm not looking for a beautiful woman. I only hope for someone who will stay." She thought of him, a man she had never seen, whose age she didn't know, but whose words carried the weight of loss. Maybe that pain was what made his letter feel more honest than any promise she'd ever heard. She wondered, if he learns, "I'm not the woman in the picture, will he hate me? Or will he understand that sometimes the truth only shows itself when you've got nothing left to lose?" That question lingered in her mind through every mile, through the roar of the wheels and the breath of the coal smoke. She wasn't afraid of poverty or cold. She was only afraid of being seen and then turned away. Just like before, on the 5th day, the train stopped at a small station near Wyoming to take on coal. Clara stepped down, breathing in the air dry, sharp, tinged with the scent of burnt grass. The sky stretched endlessly above, so wide it seemed ready to swallow her loneliness whole. An old man sitting nearby smiled at her. "You're traveling far?" "Miss, yes, sir. Montana." "Ah," he nodded. "Wind's rough up there, but the land's kind. If your heart's good, that place'll give you a home." Clara bowed her head in thanks. His words were simple, but they felt like a prophecy. When the train finally crossed into Montana territory, snow had begun to fall soft and white against the dark line of pines. Through the frosted window, Clara saw endless prairies stretching to the horizon, scattered wooden houses with smoke curling from their chimneys, and children chasing each other through the wind. She pressed a hand against her chest. Her heart beat slow, steady, but resolute. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I'll live kindly." The woman she had helped slept peacefully now, her baby nestled against her chest. Clara tucked the blanket around them, then turned back to the window. A single snowflake drifted down, landing in her palm, small, cold, and gone too soon. She smiled. If this is where I'm meant to be, then maybe fate was right. The train pulled into Willow Creek Station just before dusk. The last light of day spilled gold across the distant hills, and the air smelled of hay, milk, and something faintly warm like a promise waiting to be kept. Clara rose, her heart hammering. In just a few minutes, she would meet the man from the letters, the man who didn't know she wasn't the woman in the picture. And across the platform, Samuel Carver stood waiting, hat in hand, his gaze lost somewhere between the fading sun and the edge of what was about to become his new life. He didn't yet know that this moment, the moment she stepped down from that train, would change both of their lives forever.
You promised me we would be
When
safe
Clara
here.
stepped
What
off
is
the
going
train,
on? I know,
Samuel
but things
knew
have
at once she
changed.
was not the woman in
We
the
need to keep
photograph.
moving.
Yet instead of disappointment, he simply stood still. Because in those eyes, there was something that made it impossible to look away. Perhaps it wasn't difference he saw at all but truth. That evening, the sun was fading over the
That should hold
Montana
it.
prairie.
It's perfect.
The sky stretched wide and red, streaked with thin clouds like burning threads of wool. The train's whistle tore through the air, scattering the scent of coal and dry grass into the wind. Samuel Carver stood at the far end of the small Willow Creek Station, his old wide-brimmed hat in hand, brown hair tousled by the breeze. He'd been waiting all week for this train, the one that would bring the woman his letters had reached, at least in his imagination. He remembered every line of her picture, a fair-haired woman with a confident smile. Her letters had spoken of a love for open skies, of a willingness to work hard, of a heart ready for a new beginning. He'd believed she might be the one to bring laughter back into a house that had known only wind and hoofbeats for far too long. But when the third car stopped and the woman stepped down, everything changed. She was smaller than he expected, thinner too. Her dark hair was tied hastily with a frayed ribbon. Her blue dress was plain, her shoes dusted with dirt, and her wooden suitcase had a crack along one corner. Nothing about her matched the woman in the photograph. And yet Samuel could not move, because her eyes, they weren't searching, nor afraid. They were the eyes of someone who had known loss, yet still carried the strength to believe in goodness. Something in those eyes made him feel seen again, a feeling he hadn't known since his wife's passing. Clara stood a few steps away, gripping her suitcase tightly. She couldn't look up. She knew she wasn't the woman he was expecting. She knew that no explanation could erase the truth of that photo in his coat pocket. But when his voice reached her low, steady and real, she trembled. "Hello," he said. Samuel Carver." His tone wasn't that of a disappointed man. It sounded like someone trying to step past sorrow to begin again. Clara's voice cracked softly as she answered. "I'm Clara Whitmore." That was all. No defense, no excuse. A gust of wind knocked his hat from his hand. As Samuel bent to pick it up, he caught her taking a quiet breath, bracing herself for whatever came next. And somehow, he smiled the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. "Welcome to Willow Creek, Clara. It's a long ride. You must be tired. The ranch is about 2 miles from here. It'll take you home." He offered his hand. Clara hesitated, then placed hers in his. His palm was rough, sun-worn, a faded scar tracing his wrist. And somehow, when their hands met, a strange calm spread through her, a peace she hadn't known she was missing. The road from the station wound through a narrow valley, lined with wildflowers swaying white in the fading light. The sun was sinking low, setting the sky ablaze in orange and gold. Samuel drove the old wooden wagon. Clara sat beside him, silent, watching the birds cross the distant ridge. The wind tugged gently at her dress, catching the last glimmer of sun in her dark hair. "After a while," Samuel asked quietly, "did you bring much with you?" "Just a few things," she said softly. "And one letter." That made him glance over, curious, but instead of asking, he only nodded, and the silence between them felt full rather than empty. Sometimes the truest things are said without words, and in that silence, between two strangers, a fragile thread began to form, woven not from promises, but from understanding. By the time they crossed the small creek before the ranch, dusk had settled. The Carver homestead appeared through the dim light, modest but neat, its windows glowing with a golden firelight. "You can rest here tonight," Samuel said quietly. "Tomorrow morning, we'll talk about everything." Clara nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. On the porch, she paused. Her eyes caught on a violin hanging dusty on the wall.
You promised me we
She
would
brushed
be
a
safe
finger
here.
across
What
the
is going
strings.
on?
A faint,
I know,
trembling
but
note
things have
filled the
changed.
air,
We need to
sad
keep
but
moving.
soft as breath. Behind her, Samuel's voice lowered. "She used to play that," he said. "My wife." Clara turned slowly. Then, with gentle sincerity, she said, "I believe some sounds never truly fade. They just wait for someone to listen again." He didn't reply, only turned away. But at the corner of his mouth, a small, unexpected smile appeared. His first in years. That night, in the little room he'd prepared for her, Clara sat by the window. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the moon hung low over the hills. She placed Margaret's photograph beside the candle. "If he finds out," she murmured, "will he hate me?" Then, with a faint smile, she shook her head. "No. If this began with a lie, the only way to save it is with the truth." And under the trembling candlelight, Clara made herself a promise that whatever came next, she would live honestly. Because the man out there, the man who had offered his hand instead of judgment, deserved nothing less. That night, Samuel didn't sleep. The image of the woman with the gentle eyes kept returning to him like the faint glow of a fire in the hearth, small but unyielding. And in the next room, Clara sat by candlelight, rewriting letters she had never dared to send. Neither of them knew that truth was already on its way, a truth that would test them both, not through words, but through faith. The next morning, the sun rose earlier than usual, spilling gold through the window of the small wooden house where Clara stayed. Outside, the sounds of the ranch were waking the crowing of roosters, the steady thud of a hammer from the barn, the whisper of wind curling under the eaves. It all blended into a kind of peace Clara had never heard before. She washed her face in cold well water and caught her reflection in the cloudy mirror. The woman staring back at her had darker skin now, tired eyes, and the marks of a long journey across a country. "This is me," she whispered. "No one else." It was a reminder and a quiet act of courage. Out in the yard, Samuel Carver carried a pail of milk still steaming from the morning's milking. He saw Clara hanging a wet cloth on the line. A faint smile flickered across his face and vanished just as quickly. "Breakfast ready," he said, his voice deep and steady, like oak wood. Clara nodded, following him inside. On the rough-hewn table lay toasted bread, butter, and a small pitcher of milk. They ate in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Then Samuel looked up, his gaze resting on her face, soft, searching, but edged with something unspoken. "Clara," he said quietly, "there's something I need to ask you. Is there anything you'd like to tell me?" Her hand froze. The small piece of bread slipped from her fingers.
There.
She drew a slow,
That should hold it.
trembling breath.
It's perfect.
It was time. "Mr. Carver," she began, her voice shaking, "I need to tell you the truth. I'm not the woman you were promised. I'm not the one in the photograph you received." The room fell silent. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. She went on, her words careful, heavy as if unraveling a knot tied long ago. "The woman in the photo is my sister, Margaret. She was supposed to come here, but my family needed the money, and she didn't want to leave the city. They sent me instead. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I was afraid you'd send me away." She bowed her head. The tears that fell weren't from fear of rejection, but from the weight of holding the truth for too long. Samuel said nothing at first. He sat still, his hand gripping a cup of cold coffee, his eyes fixed on the window. In the morning light, his face showed every line of the years, the scar at his temple, the tight set of his jaw, and the quiet grief that lived in his gaze. Then he spoke. Slowly, I knew. From the very first moment. Clara looked up, startled. "You knew?" "Yes." "The woman in the picture had golden hair." "You don't." The woman in the picture smiled like she'd never known hardship. "Your eyes held something no photograph ever could." He paused, his voice lowering, gentle and firm all at once. "Am not angry. Clara, if there's anyone to blame, it's the ones who treated marriage like something to be traded through the post." She bit her lip, trying to steady her breath. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just couldn't live another day pretending to be someone I'm not." Samuel nodded, his expression softening like a lake after the rain. "Thank you for telling me the truth. Honesty. Clara, that's rarer than gold out here." He stood and turned toward the window, then back to her. "If you wish, stay. Not as a bride, not yet, but as a helper, until we both understand what this really is." Clara stared at him, speechless. She had braced herself for anger, for cold silence, even contempt. Instead, she found kindness, something she'd never been given by any man before. Her voice trembled. "Thank you, Will. Work hard. I promise. I know you will," Samuel said. "But don't just work to make amends. Live, Clara. Let this place be where you start again, for both of us." In the days that followed, the air around Carver Ranch began to change. Clara rose early to light the stove, cleaned the stables, learned to braid rope, and cooked beef stew the way Samuel liked it. She didn't complain, didn't shrink away. She simply gave each task her quiet care. Samuel, though still a man of few words, found his eyes drawn to her whenever he passed that small figure, brown hair lifting in the wind, carefully mending his worn shirt in the afternoon sun. Sometimes he wondered if not for that cruel trick of fate, would I ever have met her? One evening, they sat together on the porch, the firelight flickering from the open kitchen door. Samuel spoke at last about his late wife, the storm that took her, and the silence that had haunted his home ever since. Clara listened, saying nothing,
Promised me we would be
only
safe
laying
here.
her
What is
hand
going
gently on the table,
I
and
know,
his
but
voice
things have
faltered, a
changed.
gesture of comfort
We need
that
to keep
needed no
moving.
words. And in that stillness, Samuel realized something profound. Truth doesn't always break what's fragile. Sometimes it's the very thing that lets you begin to trust again. From that day on, inside the small house
should hold it.
on the open prairie,
Perfect.
laughter began to return. Not loud, not hurried, but soft, like the whisper of wind through wild grass. Samuel taught Clara how to ride a horse, and she taught him how to trust again. And though neither ever said it aloud, both understood sometimes. Love doesn't grow from promises, but from truth that has been forgiven. The early mornings at Carver Ranch always began with a heavy mist, blanketing the fields in white. The sun took its time breaking through, and when the first light touched the wooden fence, Clara had already lit the stove and carried a steaming pot of coffee out to the porch. Samuel was always up before her, working in the stables long before dawn. But there was one thing he never failed to do. He always left a small sign behind, sometimes a sprig of wildflowers on the table, other times a note scribbled in rough handwriting. "Wind strong today. Don't go to the well alone." Clara never mentioned it, but those small gestures warmed her heart more than the coffee in her hands. Life on the ranch was far from easy. Spring came late that year. Snow still clung to the distant hills. Newborn calves were weak, needing warmth and milk every few hours. Clara had never lived a life of hard labor, but she learned quickly how to tie a rope, how to mend a saddle. One morning, Samuel saw her struggling to lift a hay bale twice her size. He stepped forward to help, but she shook her head, smiling. "Let me. You can't teach me if you keep doing it for me." Her words made him laugh, a real laugh, rough and short, the kind that startled the horses in the barn into looking up in surprise. Soon, folks around Willow Creek began talking about the quiet young woman living at Carver Ranch. Mrs. Eunice Baker, the elderly neighbor, stopped by with a basket of eggs and blinked in surprise at the warm smell drifting from the once silent house. "What's that you're cooking, dear?" she asked kindly. "Just cornbread, Mom." Clara smiled. "I added a bit of honey. My mother used to make it that way." From then on, Mrs. Baker came by every week bringing eggs, news, and chatter about everything from the new church being built to the mayor's daughter's upcoming wedding. And before long, people were saying, "It's that Carver girl who finally made the rancher smile again." Clara didn't know whether it was true, but she began to feel something she hadn't in a long time, that she wasn't the girl sent in someone else's place, but a woman who belonged. On golden afternoon, when the sun dipped low across the prairie, Samuel and Clara often led the horses down to the creek. He taught her how to speak softly to calm a skittish colt, how to set a saddle so it wouldn't chafe the shoulder, and she, in return, taught him how to brew chamomile tea, how to stitch a torn sleeve, and how to sit in silence without feeling alone. "I used to think I didn't need anyone," Samuel said one evening as they watched the water shimmer in the fading light. "And now?" she asked, her eyes following the current. "Now I think maybe people only say that before they meet someone who truly listens." She didn't answer, but when the wind lifted, her shawl brushed his hand, leaving behind a warmth that lingered. Clara learned to love the land, not through words, but through work. She planted corn behind the house, tended rows of onions and herbs, swept every worn board on the porch until it gleamed. Samuel told her that here, in Montana, winter tested your spirit, but summer rewarded those who waited. And when the first green sprout broke through the soil, he smiled at her and said, "You're the same way, Clara. Slow maybe, but you'll bloom, sure as spring." Each Sunday, they rode into town together for church. The people of Willow Creek grew used to the sight, the quiet rancher walking beside the gentle, brown-haired woman. Children ran to hold her
You
hand.
promised me we would be
Women
safe
invited
here.
her
What
to
is
pie
going
socials
on?
and quilting
I
circles.
know, but things have changed.
No one asked anymore
We need
where
to
she'd
keep
come
moving.
from, as if her past no longer mattered. And Samuel, too, began to notice how her presence changed everything. The ranch, once haunted by silence, now breathed again. Where duty had once kept him moving, now it was the thought of finding her at the wooden table each morning, waiting with his coffee. Then came a late summer storm. Thunder split the sky. Lightning flashed over the hills. A young calf broke free of the pen, terrified. Samuel rushed out into the rain, and Clara ran after him without thinking. They chased the frightened animal across the muddy field, working together in the downpour until they herded it safely back to shelter. When it was over, both were soaked to the bone, hair plastered, hands shaking and laughing hard and freely. Their voices carried through the storm. A flash of lightning lit her face, raindrops glistening like glass. Samuel looked at her, his breath caught, and whispered almost to himself, "Maybe God didn't send you here to take someone's place. Maybe he sent you to save me." Clara lowered her head, and the rain mingled with her tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not through a photograph, but through the heart of a man who had once forgotten how to believe. From that day on, during the brief Montana summer, something in both of them quietly changed. No one said a word, but each time their eyes met across the smoke of a morning fire or the glow of the hearth at night, there was a tenderness deeper than any spoken confession. Because sometimes love doesn't begin with words. It begins with trust. Summer drifted slowly across the endless prairie. The oat fields ripened into shades of deep gold, and the wind rolled over them like waves upon a sea. Each morning, before dawn fully broke, Clara and Samuel rose. There was no need for a call or a clock. The creak of the barn door was signal enough. If one was awake, the other would already be there. They no longer held that careful distance of strangers. Between them lay a quiet comfort, the kind that only grows when two souls begin to understand one another simply by being there. One morning, Samuel asked Clara to ride out with him to check the northern pastures. She hesitated, never having gone that far before, but the calm steadiness in his eyes made her nod. The trail wound beneath an old row of willows, crossed a shallow creek where sunlight danced on the water like silver. Clara sat tall in the saddle, her hands light on the reins, her wide-brimmed hat shading her face. The wind tugged playfully at her dark hair, and beside her Samuel's voice blended softly with the rhythm of hoofbeats. "I used to come here with my mother," he said. "She'd gather wild chamomile to dry for tea. Said the scent could warm even the coldest winter." Clara smiled gently. "Do you still come here?" He shook his head,
There.
gazed distant.
That should hold it.
"Not since she
Perfect.
passed. I couldn't. But today I think she'd be glad I brought someone here." His words were quiet as breath, but to Clara they felt sacred. She dismounted, bent to pick a small golden flower, and placed it in his hand. "For her," she said softly, "and for your memories." Samuel looked down at her small hand resting over his, and for the first time, he let himself hold it, not to claim her, but to say some pain can be shared. After that day, they spent more time together. She followed him out to the open range, learning to tell coyote tracks from deer prints. He told her stories from the war, and about his father, the man who had once taught him to ride with the words, "Don't guide the horse with the reins. Son, guide it with your trust." Clara listened quietly, eyes tracing a hawk circling high above, thinking that perhaps Samuel was learning to trust her the same way a horse trusts its rider. One afternoon, rain came suddenly. They took shelter under the eaves of the cattle shed, the downpour rattling hard against the wooden roof. Samuel shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "You don't have to," she began. "Keep it," he said firmly. "The rain here cuts cold, and you're too thin to fight it." His voice was no longer that of a rancher giving orders. It was the voice of someone who had begun to care. She fell silent, watching the raindrops roll down his arm, pausing over an old scar. Something inside her stirred a quiet trembling, like a violin string touched by the wind. In the days that followed, Samuel no longer avoided the past. One evening, in the small kitchen, while Clara was rinsing rice, he stood nearby, voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "My mother died when I was 14, he said. "For years I worked myself raw, thinking maybe she'd see and come back. But life doesn't work that way." Clara looked up, her hands still in the water. "I think she has seen," she said softly. "She sees it in how you live, in what you keep alive. People don't really disappear. Samuel, not while someone remembers them." He didn't speak again, only nodded and added another log to the fire. The flame flared up, casting warm light across both their faces, and in that glow, Clara saw clearly what she'd only sensed before. Behind his quiet strength was a man slowly relearning how to believe in kindness. One morning, as they rode across the meadow, Samuel reined in his horse and stared at the sunrise. The mist was lifting, golden light spilling over the land. "You know, Clara," he said after a long pause, "for the first time since my mother died, I don't feel alone anymore." She didn't answer. She only tightened her reins so that her horse walked beside his, step for step. And though they never touched, the space between them simply disappeared. That night, Clara brought a small lamp out to the porch. The glow flickered over her face as Samuel sat nearby, carving a new saddle piece by hand. She threaded a needle, quietly mending the torn strap on his coat. No declarations, no grand gestures, just two souls working side by side in peace. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of hay and hearth smoke as if the land itself were offering them its quiet
You
blessing.
promised me we would be safe here. What
As
is
time
going
passed,
on?
the
I know,
small
but
things
things have
between them
changed.
began to gather
We need
like
to keep
drops of
moving.
rain seeping into dry earth, quietly feeding the roots below. Samuel never noticed when he'd begun waiting for the sound of her footsteps each morning, and Clara, whenever he was away, would rest her hand against the window pane,
There.
eyes
That
fixed
should
on
hold
the
it.
dusty road that led out of
Perfect.
sight. Neither spoke it aloud, but somehow their hearts had already begun to beat in the same rhythm. Autumn came slowly, carried on dry winds that smelled of burnt grass. At Carver Ranch, the harvest season brought long days and golden fields. Clara, dressed in her simple linen dress, walked beside Samuel gathering armfuls of ripe oats, her cheeks flushed pink beneath the warm sun. Folks in Willow Creek said it was rare to see old Mr. Carver smiling so much. Everything seemed perfectly still, perfectly right until one morning. The wind carried back the shadow of the past. The postman's wagon stopped at the ranch gate, leaving behind a letter sealed with red wax. Samuel was still out in the field. Clara accepted the letter, her hands trembling as she recognized the uneven handwriting, Mrs. Whitmore. Her breath caught. She sat on the porch and opened it. Each word cut sharp and cold against the still morning air. "Clara, our family is disgraced by your deception. Margaret was the one Mr. Carver chose, not you. The whole of Boston knows it. You've brought shame upon your sister and this family. Leave that place before we must send for you ourselves. Mother, Clara read the short letter again and again, refusing to believe it. There was no kindness in it, no single word of care, only command, cold, final, and painfully familiar. That afternoon, she rode into town to buy flour. Near the counter, 2 women whispered behind her back, "I heard she's an impostor, not the real bride Mr. Carver sent for. Truly, they say her sister's coming soon to take her rightful place." Clara didn't turn around. Her hand tightened, and the bag of flour slipped to the floor, bursting open. White dust rose like thin fog, veiling the tears she refused to shed. That night, she returned home late. Samuel was waiting on the porch, the lamplight flickering over his face. Seeing her pale and shaken, he asked quietly, "Something wrong?" "Clara." She forced a small smile, her voice trembling. "No, I'm just tired. That's all." He studied her for a long moment, then simply said, "Get some rest. We've got hay to haul in the morning." But that night, Clara didn't sleep. The letter lay hidden in her drawer, burning like an open wound. She sat by the window, watching the moon rise, her heart heavy with guilt. "I took what was never meant to be mine," she thought. "If Margaret comes here, they'll all think I deceived him. Samuel will lose his good name and everything else." Tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink into faint gray lines. She folded it, slipped it into her pocket, and looked around the small room shed, come to call home. Everything carried his warmth, the coat he'd draped over her shoulders that rainy night, the wooden cup he'd carved for her, the dried flowers she'd hung on the wall. She touched each one gently, as if saying goodbye. By dawn, Samuel found the barn door open and the second saddle missing. On the kitchen table lay a small folded note, written in her delicate hand. "I'm sorry. I can't let you bear the shame of my deceit. Thank you for showing me what kindness truly means. Clara." He crushed the paper in his fist and bolted out the door. Mounting his horse, he rode hard, the cold wind whipping past, dust rising in his wake. He didn't think, didn't stop. He only knew he couldn't let her go. Clara walked along the trail toward the train station. The fog was thick, blurring the path ahead. She moved slowly, dragging her small suitcase behind her, her heart aching with every step. She didn't know if leaving was right or wrong, only that staying felt impossible. Then, from behind the veil of mist, came a voice deep, urgent,
I know, but things have
breaking
changed.
through the quiet morning.
We need to keep moving.
Clara stopped. She turned. Samuel was galloping toward her, his coat flying, his face streaked with sweat and mist. He leapt from his horse and strode to her, still catching his breath. "Why are you leaving?" She lowered her eyes and handed him the letter. "My mother wrote this. She says I stole my sister's place. I don't want you to be looked down on because of me." Samuel read the letter in silence, then lifted his gaze to her. There was no anger there, only a quiet sorrow. "You think my honor depends on the words of someone who's never met me, Clara? A man's honor doesn't come from what people say, it comes from how he lives." Her tears finally broke free. "But what if my sister really comes? Then you'll tell her the truth," he said, his voice steady. "That I don't want a woman sent through the mail. I want the one who spoke with honesty, who loved with her hands and heart. I choose you, Clara." The world around them fell silent, only the thudding of their hearts and the soft hiss of wind through the fog. Samuel stepped closer, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "Stop running from the past," he said softly. "It's only a shadow now. We're the ones still standing in the light." Clara bowed her head, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. When she looked up, the mist had begun to lift. The first light of dawn spread over the distant mountains, painting them in gold. "I've been running all my life," she whispered, "but maybe this time I should stay." Samuel smiled a quiet, genuine smile that carried peace instead of pride. He held out his hand. "Let's go home. Clara." She placed her hand in his light as a promise, strong as a vow unspoken. Behind them, the train whistled long and low, fading into the horizon. Ahead of them, the road back to the ranch stretched wide under the morning sun, where winter waited, and where love had finally taken root, deep and enduring. From that morning on, there was nothing left between them to hide. Clara had learned to face her past, and Samuel, for the first time in years, dared to dream of a future. Winter was drawing near, and across the snow-covered plains, they would soon write a promise that needed no paper, no ink, only faith. That morning, the sky was the color of ash, and the wind carried the bite of early winter. Fog hung thick over the prairie, swallowing the far-off hills in a curtain of white. At the train station, the iron engine hissed like some great, breathing beast preparing to leave. Clara stood on the platform, clutching her wooden suitcase, her mind full of voices from the past, her mother's commands, her sister's silence, and the words she'd never found the courage to say to him. "Leaving is right," she told herself. "If I stay, it'll only bring him shame."
That should hold it.
But even as she tried to believe it, her heart twisted painfully. Each gust of wind carried the smell of smoke and dry grass, the scent of the ranch, of mornings beside the fire. It brought back his voice low and steady, the rare smile that softened his whole face, the rough hands that once held hers in the rain. Then, through the whistle of the departing train, she heard it, the thunder of hooves pounding the dirt road. Heads turned. Out of the mist rode a dark figure, coat flying, horse kicking up a trail of dust. Samuel Carver. Clara froze. He swung down from his horse, striding through the crowd, breath sharp in the cold air, his eyes fixed on her. "Clara!" It wasn't just a call. It was a declaration. The platform went still. Even the hiss of the train seemed to fade. Samuel stopped in front of her, his gaze steady, a quiet fire burning behind it, something between pain and faith. "Why are you leaving?" Clara lowered her eyes, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Because I don't want you to be humiliated. They say you were deceived, that I'm only a stand-in. I can't let your name be dragged through the mud because of me." Samuel drew a slow breath, then spoke clearly, so everyone could hear. "My honor doesn't lie in what people whisper, Clara. It lies in the heart of the woman I choose." He stepped closer. His voice deepened. "I don't want a perfect photograph. I don't want a name someone else picked out for me. I want the woman who told me the truth, the one who stayed when things were hard. That woman is you." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "He's chosen her. Someone said, 'This will be all over town.'" Another whispered. But Samuel didn't care. His eyes never left hers. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "You say that, but if my sister finds out, if my mother hears, they'll never let it rest." Samuel shook his head slowly. "I'm not marrying your family. I'm choosing you. Clara Whitmore. Whatever your past holds, I know who you are now." He leaned forward, voice low and rough but sure. "And if anyone asks whether I regret it, I'll say no. Because it was that so-called deception that brought me to the only truth I've ever wanted." Clara stood caught between fear and that steady, grounding truth, between the world that shamed her and the man who saw her. Her tears glimmered, but her gaze no longer trembled. "You're not ashamed," she whispered, "that they'll say you were fooled." "No." Samuel smiled faintly. "I'm grateful I was." The words broke the last wall inside her. The train let out a long whistle, the wheels clanking as it prepared to move. Samuel climbed the step beside her and took her hand. "If you board that train, I'll ride after it. But if you stay, I promise, I won't let anyone make you bow your head again." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. The world fell away, the noise, the people, the steam. Only his face, his breath, the warmth of the hand that had never once let her feel alone. She looked at the train, then back at him, at the man who had listened to her tears, who had sheltered her in the storm, who had taught her that trust could grow again, even after betrayal. And she set her suitcase down. "I don't want to run anymore," she said
You
softly.
promised me we would be safe
"I want to
here.
go
What
home."
is going on?
Samuel's smile
I know,
came
but
slowly,
things have changed.
tenderly,
We need to
a
keep
smile
moving.
that could melt the frost off winter's edge. He took her hand and led her through the platform. As dawn light began to break through the mist, people watched in silence. Some bowed their heads. Others smiled faintly, as if they
There.
just witnessed something
That should
rare.
hold it.
A man
It's
brave
perfect.
enough to choose real love in a world full of pretense. As they rode home, the cold road stretched ahead, glistening under a pale sky. Samuel spoke quietly, his words barely above the wind. "From this day on, no matter what anyone says, you're the one I choose. Not because you're perfect, but because you're real." Clara leaned gently against his shoulder, her voice trembling with emotion. "I never thought anyone would choose me, after everything." "Then let me be the first," he said simply. The road back to Carver Ranch stretched long beneath the fading sun. The Montana wind carried a soft hum, a song of courage, of forgiveness, and of a love that needed no proof to be true. When they returned to the ranch, snow had begun to fall. Each flake drifted down like a gentle punctuation mark of fate, soft, certain, and eternal, settling upon the road they had chosen to walk together. And in that harsh Montana winter, there would be one flame that never went out, a fire kindled by trust and by a love born of truth. That afternoon in Willow Creek was the color of pewter, the sky gray, the air silvered with mist and rain. The train platform still bustled, but no one spoke. They all simply watched a dust-covered rancher standing before the woman he had just won back from the hands of judgment. Samuel Carver never took his eyes off Clara. Her hair was tangled from the wind, her small hands trembling around her wooden suitcase. In the dim haze, she looked fragile, as if she might fade into the sky itself if he didn't hold her there. He reached for her hand, his touch steady, his gaze gentle and grounded, like earth after rain. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "we've come too far to stop here." She lifted her eyes to him, eyes clear and sorrowful, like a quiet autumn stream. "What are you saying, Samuel?" He drew in a deep breath, and there in the middle of the busy station, surrounded by steam and rain, he went down on one knee. "I've searched for what I needed all my life," he said, "and never thought I'd find it in the woman the world called a mistake. I don't need a photograph, or a reputation, or the promises of old letters. I just need you, Clara Whitmore." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried clear and steady through the hush. The whole station seemed to hold its breath. A woman whispered, "Dear Lord, he's proposing to her." A younger man chuckled softly. If there were more men like him, maybe this world would be a kinder place. Clara stared at him, her eyes shining with tears she couldn't hold back. She had come to disappear, to leave quietly and vanish like a mistake never spoken of. But now, before everyone, he had called her by name, and chosen her. "Samuel," she whispered, "I have nothing to offer but a broken heart." "That's enough," he said with a soft smile, "because that's all I have, too." Rain began to fall harder, but no one moved. Samuel reached into his coat and drew out a simple silver ring, hand-carved and old, glowing faintly in the gray light. "This ring belonged to my mother," he said. "She used to tell me true love doesn't need gold, only warmth." He slipped it onto her finger. Her hands were cold, but her heart burned warm. She nodded a small, trembling motion and whispered, "Yes, I do." Her voice was barely above the rain, but it rippled through the crowd like sunlight on water. People clapped, someone cheered, someone else wiped away a tear. And there, beneath the steam and the sound of the departing train, Samuel rose and pulled her into his arms. His coat was soaked, her hair damp with rain, but neither of them let go. They rode home through a chorus of blessings. Lanterns flickered from the porches of neighboring farms.
You promised me we would
People
be safe
waved,
here. What is going on?
smiling through the drizzle,
I know, but things have changed.
as if welcoming something
need to keep
good
moving.
back from a long and bitter storm. Samuel laughed softly, leaning close to murmur against her ear, "I used to think love made a man weak. But you've shown me it makes us strong enough to stand in front of the whole world without fear." Clara smiled through her tears. "I used to be afraid of love, because I thought I didn't deserve it. But now I know. Being loved isn't about perfection. It's about someone seeing the good you forgot you had." Their horse trotted slowly through puddles, steam rising from its breath in the cold air. Above them, the gray sky began to open streaks of pale sunlight finding their way through the clouds. That night, Samuel lit a fire in the cabin's hearth. Clara set the kettle on the stove, the firelight painting her face in shades of gold and peace. He looked at her for a long time, then placed a hand gently on her shoulder as if to make sure that everything that had happened was truly real. "You'll stay?" he asked. "If you'll have me," she said softly. "I don't need permission," he replied. "I just need a promise." She met his gaze. The fire reflected in her eyes, and whispered, "I promise." Outside, the wind swept through the pines, carrying the creak of the eaves and the soft fall of dew against the roof. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound etch itself into memory. A new season had begun, a season of beginnings, of a love that had been tested and chosen. Later that night, Clara stepped out onto the porch. Snow had started to fall the first of the year. She lifted her hand and caught a few flakes, watching them melt against her skin. Samuel came behind her, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. His voice was deep, quiet, warm as the firelight inside. "From now on, whenever the snow falls, remember you stayed." She rested her head against his shoulder and whispered back, "And you don't ever stop believing in true love." They stood there together, watching the snow blanket the road that led back to the open fields. No grand wedding, no golden rings or roses, only a promise, simple and steadfast, as real and enduring as the breath of the Montana earth beneath their feet. From that day on, their lives were never the same. The Carver Ranch was no longer just a place of work, it became a home, a place where soft laughter mingled with the wind, where the things once thought lost found their way back to life. Winter came, but it had never felt so warm. For weeks, snow blanketed the wide Montana plains, then slowly melted as spring returned. Since that day at the train station, the town of Willow Creek had grown used to seeing Samuel Carver and his new wife walking side by side. There was no grand display of affection, no need for words, only the quiet peace of two souls once wounded, now healed in each other's company. That spring,
There.
Clara
That should
began
hold it.
planting her first garden
perfect.
behind the cabin rows of lavender, wild daisies, and prairie roses, the kind that could survive the harshest weather. When they bloomed, the scent drifted through the air, drawing butterflies and bees, filling the ranch with color. Folks would say, "The Carver Ranch is blooming this year, not just in the soil, but in the hearts of its people." Samuel, returning from the far pasture, would often stop by the fence just to watch her, the woman who had once arrived on a mistaken letter, now the heart of the whole place. But Clara didn't just tend the garden. She began teaching the local children, sons of ranchers, loggers, and widows who had journeyed west in search of a new life. Classes were held in an old barn that Samuel had rebuilt with his own hands. The blackboard was made from painted wood, the chalk brought in from town, and the benches were simple planks. Samuel carved himself. She taught them to spell, to write their names, to read from the Bible, and, more than anything, to dream of a future where words could open doors no one had ever seen. Sometimes, Samuel stood outside, listening quietly as the children's voices rose together. "A apple, be bread, see, Christ." He'd smile, that soft, proud smile that never reached his lips but always reached his heart. Willow Creek began to change. More homes were built, new roads laid, and the Carver Ranch became a kind of anchor for the growing town. Widowed women, those who had lost husbands to mining accidents or the long, perilous trails west, often came to see Clara. She didn't just offer them food. She taught them how to make soap, mend clothes, and grow vegetables in the rocky soil. She would say, "If you know how to plant, even the hardest ground will bloom one day." People started calling her the Lady of Carver Ranch. At first, Clara blushed at the title, but soon she realized it wasn't about pride. It was Willow Creek's way of saying thank you. One early summer evening, Samuel returned from a distant market with a small wooden sign in hand. He hung it by the ranch gate, the carved letters catching the sunset light. Carver Homestead, where the light always waits. Clara came over, holding a basket of freshly cut flowers, her eyes shining as she read the words. "Do you really believe," that she teased gently, "that this place holds light?" "I do," Samuel said slowly, "because that light began with you." Whenever new settlers arrived in Willow Creek, they were always directed to the Carver home first. Clara would be waiting with warm bread, milk, and clean blankets. She'd ask each traveler where they came from, who needed work, who needed land, or who just needed to rest after too many miles. Some stayed, some moved on, but all remembered the gentle woman who always asked, "Have you eaten yet? Did you sleep well last night?" Soon people in town began to say, "Willow Creek keeps its heart beating because of one woman who knows how to listen." Samuel, quiet as ever, saw everything. Many evenings, they sat side by side on the porch, watching the sunset spill across the distant hills. She'd bring out 2 mugs of tea, one for him, one for herself. Sometimes she'd tell him stories about her students. Other times, they'd just sit and listen to the wind. "I used to think happiness was something men like me couldn't afford," he said once. And now she asked softly,
"We would be safe here. What is
"Now
going
I think
on?"
it only needs a
I know,
porch
but things
and
have
someone
changed.
willing to sit
We
beside
need to
me."
keep moving.
Clara smiled and rested her head on his shoulder, out on the horizon. The cattle were returning home, dark shapes moving slowly against the golden blaze of the sky. It was a simple scene, yet it filled the soul like
There.
prayer.
That should
Autumn
hold it.
came again.
It's perfect.
The children in Clara's class could now read, and even write letters to their fathers working far away. One afternoon, little Lucy, daughter of the widow Mary Ann, handed her a folded paper. In careful, uneven handwriting, it read, Thank you, Miss Clara. I want to grow up to be like you, the one who makes people believe life can still be good. Clara smiled, folded the note gently, and tucked it inside her worn Bible. She didn't know that outside the doorway, Samuel had been watching, his eyes glinting with quiet pride. That night, as they lit the oil lamp together, he said softly, "You know, when they call you the Lady of Carver Ranch, I think no one could ever deserve it more." Clara laughed, her eyes glowing like the flame between them. "I'm just a woman who plants flowers, teaches children, and bakes bread." Samuel reached over, his voice tender. "And that's why you've done the greatest thing of all. You've made the world gentle again. They say true kindness shines brightest when the world turns dark, and in the winter of 1883 in Willow Creek, that light bore a woman's name, Clara Whitmore Carver. After 3 peaceful years, winter came early and harder than anyone could remember. Snow buried the Montana plains so deep that even the wagon trails vanished beneath the white. The wind screamed through the pine ridges, rattling barn doors and scattering lost cattle across the frozen land. At first, folks thought it was just another hard season. Then families began to fall ill one by one. A strange sickness swept the town, high fever, dry cough, and exhaustion that left strong men too weak to stand. Within weeks, panic spread faster than the snowstorm itself. The town's only doctor, Dr. Franklin, collapsed from exhaustion after days without rest. Willow Creek was left to fend for itself. While most families shuttered their doors and prayed for spring, Clara packed a small satchel, a few jars of herbs, blankets, and her worn kettle for boiling water. Samuel tried to stop her. "Clara, please, stay here. I'll send someone else." But she only shook her head, her voice calm and steady. "If I'm afraid, who will go? We've lived because of others' kindness. Samuel, it's time we give some back." From that day on, Clara barely slept. She went from house to house through blizzards and sleet, carrying medicine, warm broth, and words of comfort. She never asked who had been kind and who had been cruel. Some of those she tended were the same who once called her the mistaken bride, the same who had whispered that Samuel had been deceived. But when fever left them trembling and near death, Clara sat by their bedsides, pressing cool cloths to their foreheads and whispering prayers through her hoarse voice. "Lord, please, let them stay a little longer, many nights." Samuel followed her quietly through the snow, a lantern in hand. He built fires, fetched water, and helped her brew medicine. He didn't stop her any more. He only said quietly, "I've never known anyone as strong as you, Clara." She smiled faintly. "I'm not strong. I just can't bear the thought of someone dying alone." The sickness raged for weeks. Dozens were lost. Among the sick was little Lucy, the same child who once wrote, "I want to grow up to be like you." Clara stayed by her side for 2 days and nights without rest. When the fevered girl cried out for her mother, Clara took her hand and whispered, "I'm here, sweetheart. Go on and rest." And in that moment, Samuel understood the love in Clara's heart was not something that belonged only to him. It was a gift she carried for the whole world. One morning,
You promised
after
me we
days
would
of
be safe
storm,
here. What is going on?
the sky finally
I
cleared.
know, but things have changed.
The snow glimmered
We
under
need
the
to
pale
keep
sun.
moving.
Clara went to the wooden well to wash her hands in the icy water. Samuel came up behind her, his coat dusted with frost, worry etched in his face. "You haven't slept in 3 days," he said softly. "Let me take your place tonight." She turned, weary but smiling. "If you sleep, whole boil water for the others. He said nothing, just stepped forward and pulled her into his arms. "You scare me. You know that." "Why?" she asked. "Because you're so good, I'm afraid God might want you back too soon." Clara laughed gently and placed her hand over his heart. "Then pray." "Samuel, not for less goodness, but for more time. Time to love and to help." A week later, the fever began to fade. One by one, the sick recovered. Dr. Franklin, alive thanks to Clara's care, called her the angel of the frontier, but Clara only shook her head. "I'm no angel. I just did what anyone should. And if I fall ill one day, I only hope someone will sit by my bed too." Word of her courage spread across the territory. When spring came, townsfolk gathered at the Carver ranch. They brought flowers, loaves of bread, and knitted scarves, and placed a small wooden sign at the gate for the woman who rekindled faith in the heart of winter. That evening, Samuel and Clara stood by the window, looking out across the silvered fields. Firelight flickered on their tired faces, weary, but at peace. "Do you regret it?" Clara Samuel asked quietly. "No," she whispered. "We're not here to avoid pain, but to make it mean something." He was silent for a long moment, then said, "I used to think I chose you because your heart was gentle. Now I know I chose you because it never gives up." When spring finally came, the meadows turned green again, and the sky over Willow Creek shone clearer than ever. Clara walked through the fields, her fingers brushing the first wildflowers of the season. She closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of earth, sun, and wind. She thought of every face she had tended, the fearful, the doubtful, the fragile. Maybe God never asked us to do grand things, she thought. Maybe He only asks that we don't turn away when someone needs us. Samuel came beside her and took her hand. Together they stood, watching the sun rise over the snow-capped peaks, its light spilling across the damp grass, a sign of yet another beginning. Some people must travel very far to realize what they've lost, and sometimes returning isn't about reclaiming anything, but about saying a long overdue, sorry. It was the summer of 1884, and the skies over Willow Creek shone as clear as crystal. The wide fields rippled green all the way to the foothills, and life had finally settled back into rhythm after that brutal winter.
There.
Children laughed
should hold
again
it.
by the creek,
It's perfect.
and grown men whistled as they mended fences and loaded hay on the porch of the Carver ranch. Clara stood with a basket of freshly cut lavender in her hands, her smile soft as the breeze. But behind that gentle calm, there were still quiet spaces in her heart, the kind that never fully heal, though one learns how to live with them. That afternoon, while Samuel was saddling his horse for the pastures, a carriage rolled to a stop at the ranch gate. Its wheels were heavy with dust, creaking in the dry prairie wind. From the carriage stepped a woman, her silk dress faded, her wide-brimmed hat drooping, her gloves worn thin. Clara froze. Even after all these years, she knew that face. Margaret, her sister. The two women stood still across the drifting haze of dust and sunlight. Clara said nothing. Samuel took a step forward, polite but guarded. "Good afternoon, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. Margaret lowered her gaze. Her voice trembled. "I'm not Miss Whitmore anymore. I'm just Margaret, and I didn't come here for trouble." She turned to Clara, her eyes unsteady, flickering between shame and fear. "May I come inside for a moment?" Clara nodded. No anger, no resentment, only a tired but peaceful smile, the kind that comes after years of learning how to forgive. Inside the small kitchen, the scent of herbal tea filled the air, warm, Familiar, grounding. Margaret sat down, fingers wrapped tightly around her cup, unable to meet Clara's eyes. "I heard about you and Samuel," she began softly, "about how you helped the town through the fever. I didn't believe it at first, but everyone kept saying the same thing, that you were the reason Willow Creek didn't fall apart." Clara said nothing. The late sunlight slanted across Margaret's face, no longer radiant as before, but drawn, tired, and marked by regret. "I lost everything." "Clara," Margaret said, her voice breaking, "the man I planned to marry left when he learned the truth. Father died bitter. Mother, she never forgave me. I thought if I came here, maybe I could make something right again." Clara rested her hand lightly on the table. Her voice was soft, steady like wind moving through the grass. "You don't have to make anything right, Margaret. Some things aren't meant to be fixed, only understood." Samuel entered then, setting a jug of water on the table. He didn't interrupt. He simply took his seat beside Clara, quiet and solid as ever. Margaret glanced at him, at the man she had once seen as a prize. Now she saw something else, the deep, quiet respect in his eyes when he looked at her sister. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. "I used to think you stole my chance at happiness," she whispered. "But now I know some things can't be stolen. They can only be given to the one who deserves them." Clara smiled, not with pride, not with victory, but with the peace of someone who's walked through the fire and come out whole. "I never wanted to take anything from you, Margaret. I only wanted each of us to find what truly belongs to us. Maybe happiness hasn't found you yet, but it will. It's out there, waiting." That evening, Margaret stayed for supper. Samuel built the fire while Clara cooked a simple stew, just like any other night on the ranch.
You promised
No one
me
spoke
we
of
would
the
be safe
past.
here. What is going on?
No one mentioned old letters
I know, but things have
or
changed.
cruel words
We need to keep
or the
moving.
mistakes that once tore them apart. Only the crackle of the fire and the soft wind against the pines. After dinner, Margaret looked around the cabin, the wooden walls, the glowing hearth, the quiet peace that filled the room.
There.
"It's so
should
warm
hold it."
here," she
It's
murmured.
perfect.
"I used to think happiness had to be grand, but now I see it only needs to feel like this." Before leaving, she took Clara's hands, her voice trembling. "If there's another life after this, I hope I'll learn how to love better sooner." Clara squeezed her sister's hand gently. "You don't need another life for that, Margaret. We still have this one." The carriage wheels creaked as they rolled away into the prairie dusk. From the porch, Clara and Samuel stood watching until the dust swallowed the last trace of the wagon. The wind carried with it the mingled scent of lavender and road dust, the scent of farewell and of forgiveness. Samuel rested a hand on his wife's shoulder. His voice was low, steady. Do you regret anything?" "No," Clara said. "I just feel lighter, because finally, we're both free from what used to be." That night, under a wide Montana moon, Clara opened her old Bible, the one that held Lucy's letter and Samuel's mother's silver ring. She added a new keepsake, a small embroidered handkerchief, Margaret's parting gift. On it were 3 simple words, stitched in faded thread: "Forgive me and thank you." Clara smiled, folded it carefully, and set it by the window. Outside, the fields slept under a soft silver sky. The night was so still that, if one listened closely, they might hear the past itself finally dissolving into the wind. They say that out on the frontier, spring doesn't just melt the snow, it softens the heaviness inside a person's heart. For Clara and Samuel, it was the spring of peace, of new life, growing first from within. The spring of 1885 painted Willow Creek in gentle shades of green. Wildflowers burst across the meadows. Their sweet fragrance carried through the valley on the cool Montana wind. Beyond the Carver Ranch, the creek shimmered like liquid silver beneath a sky so clear it seemed to stretch into forever. After a long, punishing winter, the town had come alive again. Men rebuilt fences, wagons rolled toward the new rail line, and laughter once more echoed across the prairie. And among all those sounds of life returning, one small bell rang out the wedding bell of Clara Whitmore Carver and Samuel Carver. The ceremony took place on the open field behind their ranch, the same one that had been buried under snow the year before. Now, it bloomed in a sea of lavender and wild daisies, purple and gold stretching all the way to the hills. There were no silks, no grand piano, no decorations from faraway cities, only the people of Willow Creek, the families Clara had nursed during the fever, the children from her little schoolhouse, the widows and workers she had once shared her bread and prayers with. They came not as guests, but as kin a community celebrating its own heart. Children scattered wildflowers, men raised a wooden arch, and women carried pies, fruit, and warm loaves from their ovens. Clara wore a simple cream linen dress, her hair pinned up with a sprig of lavender. Samuel stood beside her in his dark jacket and the old white shirt she had once mended, the mother-of-pearl buttons glinting in the sun. When the preacher spoke the vows, the breeze stirred softly, carrying the scent of grass and the sound of the faraway stream. Clara's voice trembled, but it was steady with love. "I don't promise grand things," she said, "only that no day of yours will ever be without peace." Samuel took her hand, rough, warm, steady. "And I don't ask for more," he replied, "only that we grow old together under the same roof." The town erupted in applause. A few people laughed. Some wiped their tears. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a symbol of what Willow Creek had become, a reminder that kindness and love could still take root in the hardest ground. After the ceremony, Samuel mounted a new sign at the ranch gate, the carving deep and sure. Carver Homestead, where peace begins.
You promised me we would be safe here.
Beside
What
the
is
main
going
house,
on?
they built
I know, but
something
things
new,
have changed.
a small white building
need to
with
keep
wide
moving.
windows and sunlight spilling through the door. It was Clara's dream schoolhouse. She painted the walls herself, hammered the benches, and Samuel roofed it and planted trees along the path so the children would have shade in summer. On the first day of class, more than 10 children arrived, the sons and daughters of miners, settlers, and widows, even a few whose lives she had once saved. Clara greeted each one by name, her smile so warm it made folks forget she had once come here as the woman from a mistaken letter. During lessons, Samuel often stood quietly outside the window, listening to the children sound out their letters before slipping away unseen. But Clara always knew. She would glance at the window and tell her students with a tender smile, "You see that man outside? He built this place with his own hands. So study hard for everyone who ever believed in you." And the children would chorus, "Yes, Mrs. Carver." Their voices mingled with birdsong and the murmur of the creek, the music of a town alive again. In the evenings, when class was over, Clara and Samuel often walked by the stream. They'd sit on the old flat stone, where he had first spoken his heart years ago, after the great storm. The sunset spilled gold over the fields, turning the world soft and endless. "Did you ever think we'd have this?" Clara asked one evening. "Never," Samuel said, eyes on the flowing water. "I used to think I was born just to endure. But you taught me that endurance can turn into love if you let your heart stay open." Clara rested her head on his shoulder, smiling. "Then let's keep it open, Samuel, because there are still so many hearts out there looking for a place to rest." That year, the lavender bloomed late but fuller and deeper in color than anyone remembered. Folks called it the Lady of Carver Ranch Spring. It was a season of quiet joy, of long, sunlit days, of nights spent on the porch listening to crickets in the grass, of a peace so gentle it wrapped around the land like a blessing. And sometimes, when travelers passed through Willow Creek at dusk, they swore they could hear it, the soft hum of Samuel's violin, drifting through the evening air, blending with the faint laughter of Clara Carver, a sound small enough to be missed, yet strong enough to remind anyone who heard it that even in this restless world, there still exists a place where true love lives and grows quietly, day after day. Out here on the frontier, even the driest land can bloom. Even among those who've lost their faith in people, two souls can still find each other, not for what they have, but for who they are. Years later, folks would say that every spring in Willow Creek, the lavender on Carver Hill bloomed twice as thick. Its scent drifted down into town soft but steady, as if happiness itself had seeped into the soil. Old-timers would gather the children and tell them about Clara Whitmore Carver, the girl who once boarded a train in silence, sent in her sister's place, with calloused hands and eyes as gentle as the morning sun. They'd say it was she who turned this cold, wind-worn land into a place where people remembered how to love again. And Samuel Carver, the quiet rancher, not a man of many words, but one whose eyes still lit up, even decades later, whenever her name was spoken. I didn't choose you because you were perfect. He once told Clara when both their hair had turned silver. I chose you because you were real and because from the day you came, I was never lonely again. That, folks said, was the kind of love that lasted on the frontier, simple, steady, and strong enough to outlive storms and summers alike. True love out here wasn't born from a photograph, or gossip, or some polished idea of beauty. It was built in the quiet, in the way a woman stayed up all night stirring broth for the sick, or taught a child to spell his first word, or listened without judgment when someone else's voice trembled. Clara was never called the prettiest woman, but she was the kind that made others feel safe, and that, Samuel always said, was the kind of beauty that time couldn't touch. Once, a young woman visited the Carvers and asked shyly, "Mrs. Carver, how did you know he was the one?" Clara smiled, her eyes glimmering beneath the years. When you stop trying to be loved and start wanting to be better for the one you love, then you found them. The girl fell silent, and those nearby who heard her words never forgot them, because perhaps that's what everyone needed to hear. Once in a lifetime, that real love doesn't make you tremble. It makes you peaceful. That summer, Samuel and Clara celebrated 20 years together, not in a church, but in the open field, behind their ranch. Friends, neighbors, and even the children who once filled Clara's classroom, now grown, with families of their own, returned, bringing pies, wildflowers, and laughter. Samuel looked around at the gathering, all those faces they had once helped, those who had once been strangers, now bound by years of kindness. He leaned toward Clara and said softly, "Do you see, my love? We didn't just build a ranch. We built a home for the whole valley." Clara nodded, her smile tender, and love built it, not just ours, but the love we shared with everyone who needed it. The sunset that evening burned red as wine. The wind carried the faint, sweet scent of lavender across the plains. And people said later, there are some moments that don't need to be written down, because life itself has already painted them on the heart. Clara closed her eyes as Samuel's violin began to play a soft, familiar tune that seemed to drift straight into the sky. And in her heart, she held one quiet truth, that every meeting has its purpose, And no matter how winding the road, the one meant for you will always find their way sooner or later. No one can replace the soul that was born to belong with yours. It wasn't just a saying, it was the story of their lives, proven through every season, from snow to bloom. Because true love doesn't need to be adorned, it only needs to be honest enough to endure. Honor and compassion don't create love, but they're what keep it from losing its way in a changing world. And perhaps that is the heart of what Frontier Hearts hopes to leave you with tonight.
Safe here. What is going
That within
on?
each of us, no matter how
but things have
scarred,
changed.
how
We
lonely,
need to
there
keep
still
moving.
lies a seed of goodness waiting to bloom. And if we dare to live kindly, to open our hearts once more, somewhere out there, someone is searching for that same light. And so, the story of Claire and Samuel comes
There.
to a close,
That should hold it.
not with the roar of
It's
drums,
perfect.
but with the gentle whisper of wind brushing through the lavender fields. A story that needed no miracles, because the miracle was already within the human heart. If you're still here, listening all the way to this moment, then maybe your heart beats in rhythm with Frontier Hearts, that quiet belief that even in a world forever changing, kindness still has a home. Thank you for spending your precious time walking with us through every chapter, every breath of this story. Thank you for believing that real love, even one born from a mistaken letter, can still change the course of a life. If today's story warmed your heart, if it reminded you of something or someone that once made you believe in goodness, please tap that like button, so we know there are still hearts out there that understand. If you'd like to share that warmth with a friend, a loved one, or maybe someone who just needs to be reminded that kindness still exists, share this video and let the story travel farther, like the scent of lavender carried by the wind. And if you wish to keep walking with us through stories of faith, honor, and the quiet rebirth of wounded souls, subscribe to Frontier Hearts. Because here, every week, we tell another tale, not loud, not tragic, just simple lives that know how to love in silence. In the end, somewhere between the prairie wind and the evening sun, we're all just searching for a place to belong. Thank you for letting us be part of that peaceful moment with you.